Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning into this episode of Why I Left. We're back for season 2. In today's episode, I chat with Professor Anthony Klotz. Professor Klotz coined the Great Resignation phrase, so it's an honor to have him join the show today. Currently, he is an associate professor at the University College London in its School of Management. Now, he is fascinated by the causes and effects of how and why people resign, and his work has been featured in Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the Wall Street Journal, to name a few. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back, and welcome to season 2 of Why I Left. Our guest today is the one and only Anthony Klotz. His research on resignations led to predicting a major pandemic-related labor shift, resulting in the Great Resignation in May of 2021. Now, his theory has continually been supported by record numbers of resignations in the U.S. and globally. So it's great to have him on the show, as clearly his work is an inspiration for our discussions. So hi, Anthony. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, and I'm thrilled to be here, Brian.
Me too. You have no idea how much this means. So I'm very, very excited to have you join. And, before we kind of get into some of your work and obviously the prediction that was, right, would love to get some background on you. So tell us a little bit about your background and your upbringing.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska. I grew up in a family business in the transportation industry and sort of thought I would follow in the footsteps of logistics and transportation, but ended up after undergraduate going into operations management in manufacturing plants. And, that frontline management, that warehouse manufacturing management environment is really where I sort of fell in love with the psychology of what motivates people, what energizes workers. And that stuck with me. And even when I left General Mills and worked for another small business, that stayed on my mind. And I went back and got my MBA at the time. And I took my organizational psychology class, and it just all sort of clicked for me that what we were learning in that class, I didn't realize that professor was also doing research. I just thought he taught all the time. And so I talked to him and said, I want to do what you do. Just think about management and talk about it with folks who are energized by it. He was gracious enough to explain the PhD process to me. So that led me down the path of going to the University of Oklahoma and getting my PhD in organizational behavior and HR management, where I did my dissertation on how employees quit their jobs. And that's what started me studying resignations. And then after that, went to Oregon State University for 6 years and really enjoyed that. And then moved to Texas A&M University for the most recent 3 years. And it was only about 6 months ago that I moved here to London, to University College London. And again, during this last decade of research, a lot of it has been spent studying employee resignations.
No, that's very interesting. And so, what is it about, obviously clearly passionate about resignations, but what have been, professionally, how has that driven you and why that specific piece on how people are resigning and why they resign?
Yeah, so, we have a lot of great research on why employees quit their jobs, what leads people to quit. It doesn't always make it out there into the media, I don't think, as much as it should. But what struck me when I was managing employees and when I was quitting jobs was it is a tough decision to make the decision to quit. And I found that there was a lot of advice for how to do that online. But once I made the decision to leave, especially if I was leaving a company that I liked, it was really unclear to me how to go about resigning. And there didn't seem to be any blueprint for it. The 2 weeks notice guideline isn't very useful in most cases. And so as I talked to, you know this probably better than anyone, people enjoy talking about their resignations, but it's also a very emotional and confusing time for them to navigate. And the same thing goes as when I was a manager and an employee would especially a top performer, put in their resignation, I didn't know how to respond, really. I mean, do I just pay them out for their notice period and let them go? Do they stay on the team during the notice period? How do I manage them during that time? And so I felt like there were all these really interesting and impactful dynamics that were going on within the resignation process that we weren't studying. And sometimes I just call it the overall exit transition process. And so I found that fascinating. And we can talk about this as well, but it's become more timely over the past decade as organizations focus more on boomerang employees. So treating employees well when they leave to bring them back. And so for me, this was a confusing topic for a lot of people who were going through it. There wasn't a lot of research on it, and it was increasingly important to organizations.
Oh, definitely. And, prior to joining academia, tell us a little bit about your work journey and, I guess looking back on some of the things that you know now, like how were you as a manager and how did you, evolve in your career prior to going to academia?
Yeah, I was pretty terrible at management when I started, to be perfectly honest. I moved into operations management fresh out of college, thinking way too much of myself and, was put in charge of a packaging team that wasn't performing very well. And I used my micromanaging, oppressive management style to sort of tell them I'm going to take this team from worst to first, and was really thinking about my own career more than the people that I was managing. And I did that for a couple of months. And the team actually, I came in one day and my HR manager said, "Hey, your whole team stayed over last night after the shift was over and waited till I came in at 6:30 this morning just to tell me how much they don't like working for you and how ineffective your leadership style is." So this was when I was like a brand new manager. And she asked if we could do a new manager assimilation, which meant they would pay these employees for 4 hours on a Saturday, and I would come in and they would write down on the board everything they wanted me to start, stop, and continue doing. And I'll try to keep the story short, but what ended up happening was they spent 2 hours in a room without me there, writing those things down. And then I came into the room, and I remember walking into the room and I looked at the board, and all the things that they wanted me to start doing, the board was full. All the things they wanted me to stop doing, the board was full. All the things they wanted me to continue doing, there was nothing there. It was empty. So, for me, I do really enjoy learning, and I am pretty self-reflective. And so it's just this wonderful wake-up call to that the way that I was thinking about management and what leadership is and myself was inaccurate. And so I spent the next 6 months with that team. I wouldn't say they loved me by the end of it, but it really made me realize like there's a whole psychology piece here that I'm not respecting in opting for more of the command and control style. So from then on, I took on leadership roles of increasing responsibility in high performance manufacturing systems, union environments, and these different settings. And it's just a really interesting challenge every time you walk into a situation because the situation is different. The people that you're leading are different, and it just makes for a different challenge every time. And so General Mills, the 5 years that I spent there was just wonderful in terms of the people around me being great mentors, leaders, and being patient with me as I made mistakes on that leadership journey. So that was probably the most impactful aspect for me in terms of developing as I wouldn't have called it organizational psychology at the time, but that's definitely what I was enjoying working through and trying to figure out how to make sure that when employees have energy at the start of the day, they still have it in the end of the day when they go home. And that's easier said than done for sure.
No, definitely. And then so now you leave kind of the private sector and now transition into academia. What was that shift like?
Yeah, it's a huge shift. And really, so, you move away from management. Academics are very much individual contributors a lot of the time. Most of what I'm held responsible for is publishing research in academic journals that don't necessarily get read by the broader public. And so that was a whole new challenge. The classroom is different. Like the classroom is wonderful. And that's when you're, getting to connect with, it could be evening MBA students who are going to take the lessons they learn in that class that day and apply it at work the next day, and then come back to class and tell you how it went for them. Undergraduate students and the energy that they bring. And then I have PhD students who are on this path as well. But yeah, moving from managing individuals and the responsibility that is to shifting towards studying individuals, it is a huge shift. And I definitely miss the impact that managers have. There's a famous Harvard professor who has this line that management, like no other profession, is more important when it's practiced well. And it can have such a big impact. And so for academics, the impact is a little bit more removed, except for in the classroom. And so, but I do really like the autonomy that the academic career provides. When I was working in manufacturing plants, I was always on call. If the Cheerios line went down in the middle of the night, that might mean waking up and going in and those sorts of things. That doesn't happen anymore. So there's definite trade-offs.
No, that's great. That's great to hear. Great to hear that journey too. And so now I would love to kind of take you back in time a little bit, right? And so obviously this show kind of got its origins, during the pandemic or because of the pandemic. So we'd love for you to describe a little bit how the pandemic impacted you.
Yeah. So, we often talk about that our research isn't just research, it's me search at the same time. So that question kind of taps into that. And I think, there were different reasons that the pandemic led to high levels of resignations. But maybe the one that spoke to me most, and I'm thinking about this in hindsight, was there's this, wonderfully named theory called terror management theory that explains when very serious health events happen in our life or when death is near us, we tend to reflect on life and have these big existential conversations with ourselves. Am I living the life that I want to live? Am I living a life that's in alignment with my values? Am I happy? Do I have a sense of purpose and meaning? Those sorts of things. And so these, the term pandemic epiphanies came up, and I don't know who first coined that, but I loved that term. But for me, going through the pandemic was very much, it felt like a pause button, and especially during lockdown, a time to reflect and say, okay, there was a period where we didn't know, what was going to happen. Like, which way was this going to go, especially in the early days? And so I think it did make me reflect on okay, what are the things that I've been saying I want to do in life, and am I doing them? And my wife and I, for a long time, had talked about expatriating. We travel around the world a lot. I'd led study abroad programs to London a number of times, and so it's something where I had applied to the Peace Corps and been accepted at one point years ago. I'd had opportunities to go internationally, and so I think for me, part of that reflection, what are you going to do with this one precious life sort of thing, really brought the desire to live internationally to the front of my mind. And so again, it wasn't like a huge epiphany, but it was a bit of a reprioritization for me. And some of the other factors, like being able to work from home and so forth, professors, or at least in my role, I have quite a bit of autonomy already. So those might not have been at play, but that epiphany piece a little bit, I think, was what was happening.
No, that's great. And so you talked a little bit about that me search, if you will. So what did you really start to learn about yourself during this time with that time to reflect and pause? Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah. With that time to reflect and pause, it really was thinking about, as humans, we tend to define well-being in terms of, am I happy? And am I having a life of purpose and meaning? And so for me, I think it really was reflecting on that and saying, what do I want to do? At the same time, I was teaching throughout the pandemic as well in the MBA classroom. And so it wasn't just, I was having these thoughts about terror management theory and what this was making me feel like. And I was having concerns about the amount of burnout in my profession, perhaps in my life, in my students' lives as well. So really reflecting with the students on how they were feeling going through this period of uncertainty, and looking at it through the lens of organizational psychology a lot of the time, but also looking at it through the lens of how I was feeling and what I was hearing from my students, makes you feel like I think I have some value to add in terms of explaining what's going on here. And so it wasn't like an exciting time, I would say. It was like, the pandemic for most of us was a pretty stressful time, but also a time of clarity, which, a lot of our lives aren't spent with lots of clarity around us. And so when we get those moments, it's nice.
No, definitely. And, I read that you started to, from a research standpoint, you started to notice 4 trends that really indicated that something was different in the workplace. So tell us a little bit about what you started to see during this time.
Yeah, so it was late 2020 when there was a lot of optimism about the vaccines getting here fairly soon. And I think the general thought I was seeing and hearing from leaders and in the media is that if the vaccines come, we could get back to normal really quickly and the world will just go back to the way it was. And so there were reasons that I felt that there were 4 different reasons I felt like I don't think we're just going to go right back to normal. One of them being pretty simple, in that I felt like there was a backlog of resignations in the system. And so 2020 was a year in which even if you really wanted to quit your job, you probably didn't because there was so much uncertainty. The economy was not great. There were layoffs happening everywhere. And this is normally what happens in a recession, is the number of resignations go down. But what was interesting to me is that if the economy opens back up pretty quickly, which coming out of most recessions, it slowly recovers. The pandemic meant that the economy could open back up pretty quickly, which meant there's this backlog of resignations that's going to clear really quickly if we open up quickly. And so I had looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, and yes, resignations dropped way down in 2020. And so part of it was like, we're going to move into a tight labor market because a lot of people are just sort of staying put. And when the economy opens up, they're going to enact their plans to do something different. The second trend, I already mentioned a little bit already, and it was, deriving from terror management theory. This pandemic, goes without saying, was a global health threat. And some people have called it an infodemic as well. And that every night on the news, we got this bad news about what was going on in the world and sort of scary news. And at the same time, we were locked down and had time on our hands in many cases to think. And so I just realized that there were millions of people who were perhaps going through this evaluation process spurred by the health threat of the pandemic. Am I living the life I want to live? If we, you see it in movies when there's a life or death situation. If we make it out of here, I'm going to do things different. And so I thought, when else in history has there been, millions of people having, quarter life crises or midlife crises at the same time? Usually these are spread out over time. So there was that. And then there was also burnout, of course. And, thinking back to before the pandemic in 2019, there was a lot of talk about burnout and the world of work not being sustainable. And, this glorification of hustle culture and how busy are you? Ooh, I'm busier, and, bragging about how many hours we work and these sorts of things. And the pandemic came along and just broke a lot of people who were on the edge of burnout. And burnout is a predictor of quitting. So it seemed like to me, as I was looking at reports, talking to my students, talking to leaders, what struck me is the pandemic caused increased levels of stress in almost every occupation. So leaders were being stressed out by leading through the pandemic. Frontline workers who had their lives, their health on the line when they worked. You had parents trying to educate their children while working full time. Like, everybody was there. And so it just seemed like, and I saw somebody propose at one point, like, it feels like the whole world just needs to shut down for like a month or two so that we can all just catch our breaths. And I think that's how a lot of people were feeling. Sometimes the only cure for burnout is to get away from that which burns you out. And so that's why I presumed there would be a spike in people switching jobs, people taking career breaks, taking sabbaticals, whatever it may be, which would lead to increased resignations. And then finally, there's our friend work from home and like remote working. And remote working has pros and cons. It's still very unsettled how all these different hybrid systems, and it's an exciting time for work design. The reality is that work from home or remote work provides people with more freedom in how they arrange their work days than working from the office does. And essentially during the pandemic, we gave millions of people increased freedom, increased autonomy for 12 to 18 months. How do you think that's going to go when you ask them to give that freedom back up? I mean, freedom's a fundamental human need, and especially in the US, like we don't give up our freedom, right? And elsewhere. And so, what's kind of fun is I do like that the expatriation literature, like what happens when somebody goes on an expatriate assignment. And there's the whole culture shock cycle that they go through. And then if they make it through culture shock, they get used to this new way of working in this different part of the world. And I felt like that's what happened to us with remote work as well. It wasn't an easy adjustment to set up our office on our ironing board and figure out these different ways of working. But once people adjusted to it, they're there. That's their new way of working. And so to then say, come back to the office, a lot of people are eager to get back to the office, but there was going to be, some large percentage that would say, I'd rather find another job than go back to the office. So those, for me, it just sort of, I don't know, I didn't have like a moment where it all necessarily just snapped for me. But as I put those different pieces together, it just seemed really clear that we were on the cusp of a wave of resignations.
Definitely. And then, so now how did this now then lead to you coining the phrase Great Resignation in May of 21?
Yeah, somewhat inadvertently, actually. So it's something, because I study resignations, the term resignation was in my head. I don't know why I had great in front of it. I couldn't tell you. I had sort of shared the theory with my wife and talked to her about it. And it probably would have just stayed in my head had it not been for a reporter who contacted Adam Grant and asked Adam, she was doing a story on what's the best way to quit your job. Her name's Ariane Cohen. And he said, that's not my area of expertise, but there is this one guy that studies it. And so she contacted me and we had this really wonderful conversation about my research on the different ways that people quit their jobs. What's the right way to quit your job? And at the end of the interview, I think I made an offhand comment that it's good that she's writing this story because everybody's going to quit their jobs. There's going to be this great resignation. And she was astute. I mean, a very, very talented journalist. She was astute enough to know a story, I think, when she heard it. And she said, tell me that. And so I explained that to her. And she essentially said, can you repeat that in an interview for Bloomberg in 1 week? And I said, yeah, sure. Happy to do so. Did the interview and thought nothing of it at all. And then the morning, May 10th of 2021, that morning, she sent me a WhatsApp and said, buckle up. This thing is going viral. Yeah, this is trending at the top of the Bloomberg universe. And it, what are we, 18 months later, and it's still being talked. So when it happened, I thought, okay, whatever, it's going viral. I don't, sounds good to me. I posted something on LinkedIn and then it sort of posted the article on LinkedIn and it sort of took off. And then a week would go by and I'd think, okay, now it's going to not continue. And it's just continued. And of course, after that interview, after that article ran for a month, there was no evidence that it was happening. So it was just being talked about. And, there were a number of stories that came out that said, it's not the Great Resignation. This is a great exaggeration. And I was, as an academic, I was like, it's just a theory. It's just a hypothesis. I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like it would happen, but it may be right. And then, of course, we got a month later on June 9th, we got this huge April number that showed in the April, which was before I did the interview, the numbers came out for that. And that was that big 4 million number. And it's took off from there.
And so, as an academic, this must be a once in a lifetime moment that you're actively living in right now. So like, how are you processing all of this?
Yeah, I try to, it's kind of fun to think about. We often probably don't recognize when we're at the pinnacle of our career while we're in the moment. It's only by looking back, but I'm like, no, I'm at the zenith of my career right now. And I'm never going to make a wide prediction about the labor market that goes viral and ends up being supported again. So I've tried to just approach it with appreciation and hopefully add value to people and to leaders in terms of understanding what's happening in the world right now. And I hope, in terms of making sense of it, it's been difficult because I didn't have like lots of media training, and I don't have a big support group in terms of, I should say support group in terms of brand managers around me or anything like that. So when I get an email from CNN asking if I'd like to do an interview, it's sort of overwhelming. And my mind only goes to like, what could go wrong? Like all the things, like being on live TV, this is going to be rough. Through all like the stress and sense making, I mainly feel gratitude that it's given me, as organizational psychologists, we want to have a positive impact on the world of work and increase visibility and knowledge related to our work. And so this has given me an opportunity to do that. And so even though a lot of the time it's been stressful, it's led to all sorts of cool opportunities that I'll look back on and be really grateful for. And of course, like, I like studying resignations. I like studying the offboarding process, exit transitions, whatever you want to call them. And this has really elevated the visibility of the importance of that aspect of employees' work lives. And so that's exciting as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you started a great discussion, and so, and when you think about how this moment in time from a resignation standpoint, how's it different than what you've seen in your past research? Because, I'd imagine, resignations, ebb and flow as normal, but what have been some of the differences?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly there's the sheer magnitude of it in terms of volume, but in terms of the differences in resignations is like traditionally when people quit a job, they would move into a pretty similar job. And there was not that the calculus is ever straightforward when it comes to quitting your job, but now individuals have so many more ways to piece together a career. And I think they're less fearful of taking a career break, right? There used to be all this, for my whole career, it's been like the last thing you want on your CV is a career break, right? Like is a gap, like that's horrible. And now we're sort of breaking that down, and it's okay if you take some time. And so I think what's been different with these resignations is the calculus is just a lot broader, and people are saying like, I'm going to try this entrepreneurial venture for a while. I'm going to take a career break. I'm going to stay home with family for a while. And, that often leads to leaving in more positive ways. And so as much as it's fun to listen to and watch the bridge burning stories, I think a lot of what we're seeing now is people putting their mental well-being and health first when they make these transitions, which can lead to, again, I think more positive ways of resigning in organizations. And again, fueling this boomerang trend by saying, hey, if you need to take time off 6 months or a year or a career break, that's great, or if you want to try out even this competitor or whatever, but you're a great employee. And so we'll welcome you back if it doesn't work out, if the grass isn't greener.
No, and I've seen a lot of that as well. I talk to a lot of folks, obviously on this show about that. And there is like this uptick in, the entrepreneur, solopreneur type of spirit. And it's really refreshing to see. And when you hear why people are going that route, it's for some of the reasons you very well mentioned, right? I wanted to take better care of my well-being, if you will. And this is what I needed to do, but I'm not essentially closing the door on going back to said job, but just right now, this is what I need. So I think I've been seeing that anecdotally.
Yeah, I think it's again, it can be a stressful time, but I think it's a great time for experimentation when it comes to work. And that's organizations. There's no longer a default way of working. They can experiment with different ways of working. And the reality is, for us as humans, like, I don't know if I'm going to like that job until I actually do it. And I don't know if this entrepreneurial venture is going to fulfill my soul or if it's going to drain it. Like, I want to go try these things. And it's really nice that the door doesn't just close when I leave, that organizations are increasingly open to letting people, make side hustles their primary hustles and see if it works. And if not, the employee will come back to the organization with more knowledge and perspectives that benefit the firm. So I think that's exciting.
No, definitely. And now look, oddly enough, this is what's great about this interview is obviously I wanted you on because you coined the Great Resignation phrase, but oddly enough, after being with your last university for about 3 years, you actually joined the Great Resignation yourself in May of 2022. And so, it's just luck would have it, right? So why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Yeah, there's no shortage of coworkers and colleagues in my profession that pointed out the irony of me resigning during the Great Resignation. And I sort of hinted at this earlier, but it did tie back to thinking about expatriation more broadly, like wanting to live internationally, wanting to teach in a different cultural setting. And then when I was at Oregon State University for 6 or 7 summers in a row, I came to London for a month or two, led a study abroad program, and also hung out at a few of the business schools around here, one of them being UCL, where I currently am. And so I got to know the folks here, would see them at conferences and so forth. And in the back of my mind, always thought, boy, if the stars aligned, wouldn't that be amazing to move to London and work there. And so it was really, we think of in terms of like, why do people quit their jobs? We could put them into like 2 big buckets of push and pull factors if we wanted. And so push is like having a toxic boss or dissatisfiers at your current job that are pushing you away. Pull factors are like, you just got a lucrative offer from, this company. And I love my current job, but I'm not giving up that lucrative offer, right? That pulls me away. So for me, the pull of working overseas, the pull of London in particular was really, really strong. So UCL, where I am now, had a posting and it, I contacted them and had a great conversation, and it just seemed like it was the right thing to do at the time. And so, so the reason for leaving had everything to do with the pull, for sure.
No, that's great. And, when you think about, so now, we're, I wouldn't say over, the pandemic's not over by any stretch of the imagination, but as you think about this now, what has happened since you left, and really what have you learned about yourself throughout this entire process, right? All the coining of the phrase, moving overseas, all of that. What are you picking up about you?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think a lot of it has to do, a lot of it has to do just with the term fit. And fit can be a dangerous term when you're on a hiring committee and you're like, I don't know, Brian just seems to fit better than Anthony. Like I always tell my students, like that's not the good kind of fit. But I think in reflecting on myself and saying like, at this point in my life, what kind of environment do I want to be living and working in? For a long time, I lived in college towns and worked in college towns. And it's, in many ways, I thought it's hard to beat, College Station, Texas, Corvallis, Oregon, Norman, Oklahoma, these just really great college towns. And I reached a point where I'm, early 40s, don't have children, want to be in a more vibrant place in terms of a city or something like that, but have never lived in a big city. And so, now I wake up and I get on the tube, and the university, the School of Management that I'm in is on the 38th and 50th floor of a skyscraper in London. And so for me, I think it was just like getting back out into the world late pandemic as we got to this phase was important. And I think, it was the pandemic was not great, but it was clarifying, I think, for a number of individuals. And it was for me as well, in terms of at this stage in my life, what do my wife and I want to do, and what are the career challenges that I want. And I think, the Great Resignation, as I've described it, it wasn't something that I set out to do. but it's something that has been wonderful to me and that I've been very grateful for. And I think at first, when I thought this will die down in a week or something like that, I sort of resisted leaning into it very much. And since then, I've thought, why let this opportunity go to waste, I guess, as much. And so thinking more about speaking more broadly about resignations and my research and those sorts of things, that's really opened up the opportunity for me to do that, which I never thought I would really have in this career.
No, that's really cool. And now part of the show, what I always like to share with our listeners is really advice from the guests that we bring on. And so for people who may be considering whether to resign from their role, what tips would you share with them about navigating the process and the accompanying emotions that come with it? Because I don't think that's something we talk about enough either.
Yes, yeah. So the emotions are a big piece of it, and being ready for the emotions is really important. I think when it comes to thinking about should I leave my job or not, it's something that you want to do slowly most of the time rather than quickly. And we could talk about, like, of course, there's the cost benefit analysis and those sorts of things. But I would really ask yourself, what is it about my current job that's pushing me away, if anything, if it's a push situation? And you may realize that, like, there's 30% of my job that's draining the life out of me. And I just got to get away from that. And really ask yourself, if I'm preparing to leave, could I go to my boss or someone higher up in the organization and say, can I recraft my job, to get rid of that 30%? So really just making sure, and the point of this is not to necessarily stay at your job. It may end up being that way, but it's about if you end up leaving, you can sort of say to yourself, I knew I was leaving and I did everything I could to see if I could get that worked out, which will result in lower chances of regret down the road, just knowing that you've had that conversation and that door is closed. So the first thing, and academics call this job crafting. So can I turn the job I have into the job I want? And there's some great resources online when it comes to job crafting. So that's part of it. The other part is being prepared for this really, I'll say exciting, but it's probably just an interesting power surge that comes when you start to think about quitting. Because most of the time when you work for an organization, the organization has the power. Like, we need the paycheck and they've got the money, right? And so I need to show up. If they tell me I need to stay late, I probably need to stay late. They have the power. Once you start to decide to leave, that power balance starts to shift and you don't need that organization anymore. And what's interesting about when we get a surge of power, like, power doesn't corrupt, power reveals who we are as individuals. And so just realizing that you do have this chance all of a sudden to get even if you want to get even. And when I study, like, why do people sometimes burn bridges? Why do people just walk off the job? It's not because they're bad people. It's because they've been treated poorly by their boss or they've been treated unfairly. And when they get that power, they're like, I'm going to use this power on my way out to even the scales. And so in almost every case, it's a bad idea to resign in a negative style. The only exception, I would say, is if you have a really abusive manager and you want to save your remaining coworkers by signaling that supervisor is abusive. But even then, it's risky. So I think anticipating that you're going to get this power surge and be really wary of the temptation to do anything even passively aggressive on the way out, for all the obvious reasons, right? These careers are long and you want to leave on the best note possible. So, and then of course, have a plan for how you're going to communicate your resignation. So realizing, like, who do I want to tell first? How should I tell my boss? If I want to tell my boss and then tell my 3 important coworkers, can I get that done in the time period that I want to? And so really having a clear plan for how you're going to get it done, and then asking people to respect that. And sometimes they will. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop, is kind of what you said. Be prepared for the emotional roller coaster that is leaving. Like, the 30% of that job that really annoyed you won't annoy you anymore the moment you resign. It'll kind of go away, and you'll have feelings of regret and nostalgia pretty quickly, and that's very common. And you might doubt whether you made the right decision or not. And there's been a lot made over the last year about, is this the great regret? 30% of people experience regret, or 40%, whatever. There's all these different reports. Regret is very normal because we're not leaving a job we can't stand. Like, we're leaving a job that we don't like 50% of it. The other 50%, I really like my boss, and I like the job that I'm doing. The location doesn't work for me. So it's very natural to experience regret, but sometimes when you experience it, you can kind of go into a spiral instead of being like, yeah, that was a great job and that's okay. I knew what I was leaving, and I'm happy with where I'm going.
No, and I love that. And, as I think about the evolution of the show, those are areas in which I would love to explore a bit more because, I remember even after our initial discussion, it really got me thinking about, we don't talk about resignations enough. I would say, let's just say post maybe 25, 28, you're leaving a job. That's pretty significant. Throw in kids on top of it. If you happen to have kids at the time and you decide to make that type of a pivot, so many emotions come with that. Yes, the power dynamic, but then there's also family dynamics, right? I want to take a leap of faith, but what does that mean, like, realistically? So those are as I think about this show and where I'd like to take it, your thoughts have really just been resonating with me because I'm like, that's a nice angle to explore.
Yeah, and part of the challenge of it is whatever you're going to do next, and often it's another job, but it could be anything. You don't have complete information about what that's going to be like, right? So it's not only tough to say, should I leave my current job? That's one decision. Going into the unknown, even if it's in the same industry, can be really challenging.
Definitely. And now we kind of changing focus, like for organizations, right? Many of whom are now operating, leaner teams for either resignations or either, layoffs, whatever the case may be. What advice would you share about properly handling team member resignations? And you've alluded to this in your own experience as well as, this offboarding process, right? So tell us what organizations could be doing better.
Yeah, there's a lot that organizations are starting to do when it comes to actually managing the exit transitions better than they have in the past. If you think about how many resources organizations spend in onboarding employees versus offboarding, there's this huge difference. And companies would say, yeah, of course there's a huge difference, Anthony. We're trying to bring in these new employees who are going to contribute to our organization versus someone who's leaving, who we're not going to see ever again. But that's the change that's been made, is that increasingly, because of boomerang employment, your former employees are one of your best sources of recruits for new employees. We just did a study where it shows almost, for a number of organizations, almost 30% of their new hires are people who worked for the company in the past. And so you see organizations, and then there's, of course, this increased focus on employer brand. Like, what's our reputation in the employer marketplace? And there's all of these online sources of information about companies, Glassdoor being one of the most common. And so what companies have realized is, like, if we want our employer brand to be strong, we need to treat people well during the resignation process and then when they're alums as well. And so how do we actually do that? Some of it is pretty simple. And part of it is, like, how does the manager respond the moment that an employee resigns? And right now, organizations give no training, right? And as a manager personally, especially when a high performer would leave, it's one of the most insecure moments that I would experience as a leader. It felt like I was back in high school getting dumped or something like that, And so in that moment of, like, insecurity and a lot of emotions going through, I'm focused on myself and not the other person. And I lose the opportunity to tell that person how valued they are and what can I do to help with the transition. Because what the resigning employee is nervous as well. But what they're looking for is, how is this company going to respond to me leaving? And if the very first signal you get from your manager is negative, that sends the resignation down a path of like, okay, I'm not going to be honest in my exit interview. I'm going to put in as little notes because nothing good is going to come from this. And so I think organizations are realizing training managers and how to respond to resignations is important. What's the counter offer policy? There's even one company that I talked to that when one of their high performers is leaving, they say, we don't accept your resignation. We're going to give you a 1-year leave of absence. And during that 1 year, we're going to check in with you every month or two and see how you're doing. And if during that 1 year leave of absence, you realize the grass isn't greener, that entrepreneurial venture isn't doing what you thought it would, you can come on back. And because you haven't resigned, your benefits and all those sorts of things are very easy to get rolling again. And so, yeah, so taking this really positive way of saying, how do we celebrate the employee as they leave the organization? And then, of course, when an employee resigns, so turnover contagion is real. It's not a huge effect, like it's not a massive effect, but there is a statistically significant effect that when one employee leaves, it puts the thought of resigning in other employees' minds. And so it's also important for HR managers and managers that when an employee is leaving, that you can call them stay interviews or whatever you want, but that you're touching base with the other employees and sitting down with them and saying, how's it going? We know Brian's leaving and we just want to make sure that you have the tools to do your job. If because Brian's leaving, you're asking other employees to pick up the slack until you hire his replacement, why not pay them more money during that time? If you want to stop.
Seems logical.
Yeah. I mean, because when an employee quits and we haven't backfilled her yet, everybody on the team is like, the company is saving that person's salary, right? So why not, if you're going to ask, if you want to stop turnover contagion, if you don't want to overload people, remember the loyal stayers as well and take care of them. And so I'm excited. There's been a lot more activity around offboarding and looking into how organizations can do it in more constructive ways. And it's one of those things that benefits workers and it benefits the company too. So it's a great thing.
No, definitely. And, look, my last question before we kind of wrap up is, so what's next for you and what are you most looking forward to, and any other predictions on the horizon? Yeah.
I always joke that, I made one major labor market prediction that ended up going public and was supported. I'm going to stop at 1 for 1. I'm not going to make any more predictions, but the world of work is still definitely unsettled right now. And, I think what gets a lot of attention in the media are the organizations that are saying everybody come back to work. And I won't name names, but over the last couple of weeks, right, there's been a couple of people who said, everybody come back to the office. But in reality, if as I go out and talk to groups of leaders, most leaders are really excited about the new tools that they have at their disposal to engage employees and to give employees better balance. And so right now, right, the economy isn't doing super well. It's still tough times for organizations from that standpoint. But what leaders are realizing is this is a moment where we can increase worker flexibility. We can be more inclusive. And those things don't cost a lot of money. They take trial and error and communication and all those sorts of things. But most leaders are excited and saying, what is the best way to design a hybrid work system? What is the best way to create an inclusive organization? Because we can't afford necessarily to raise everybody's wages right now, but we can make the workplace better through some of these other tools that we've learned. And when I ask groups of leaders, so there was a report from Gardner that 65% of workers say that the pandemic changed their relationship with work, changed the way they think about their job. And when I talk to groups of leaders, and I haven't shown that statistic yet, and I just say, show of hands, how many of you did the pandemic change the way that you relate to work, that you think about work? Almost all hands typically go up. And it always surprises me just how much this isn't just a worker leader thing. It changed us all. And I think So I think in this coming year, it's going to be a pretty exciting year for making the world of work better, even though, the economy may not be at its strongest, which can lead to, conversations we've had around quiet quitting and some of these different things that's going on. I think we're turning the page into this new world of work in the coming year. So it's pretty exciting.
No, that's awesome to hear. Well, look, Anthony, I am so glad that you came on the show. Clearly, I'm a fan of your work. You sparked this podcast, right? And so I'm grateful for you, taking some time to speak with me today. You've given me some good things to think about as I mentioned, as the show continues to evolve. So would love to definitely, stay in touch and follow your work, and maybe we check in on some of the trends that are happening at that point. And so would love for our listeners to, would love for you to share where our listeners can find you. So where can they find and support you?
Yeah, so most of my online presence is on LinkedIn. And otherwise, if you just, and your listeners can reach out at any point, look me up on the UCL website. My email is right there. And otherwise, I tend to put out research as I produce it, but otherwise, that's it.
Very good. All right. So that'll do it for today's episode. Again, we are back with season 2. And I wanted to just thank again, Anthony Klotz for joining us today. I'll be sure to share his information in our show notes, and I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Brian.
The Great Resignation, people leaving their jobs in droves. There's a lot of buzz happening in the job market of late. Now, did you or someone you know leave your job during the pandemic and want to share your story? We've been having some really good conversations in this space, so if you're interested, I'd love to have you join the program. If so, here's how you can do it. First, you can email us at hello@whyleft.co. That's hello@whyleft.co, or visit us online at whyleft.co. That's whyleft.co. Look forward to having you join the conversation. Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyleft.co. That's whyleft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.